All right, I'll see if I can make the clicker work. I don't know. It was really giving Bill a fit. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about horse pasture management, and then we're going to kind of wind things up with what we can do right now in terms of seeding something. And I'll burst your bubble now. We don't have a lot of great options right now for seeding something. And we're going to talk about a couple annual options that will help you get ground cover and hopefully keep some of the weeds out of your pastures. I don't know what's happening with my clicker here, but we're going to figure this out. Let's try that. All right. Just in a brief little introduction. Well, Angie, could you push my button on there? The down there? Okay. And I've got a lot of animations in mind, so she's going to be pushing the button quite a bit. So go ahead and hit the down arrow. Just to remind you all, and sometimes I think we forget this, but horses co-evolved with grasslands. They didn't evolve eating concentrate feed. They didn't evolve eating stored forage like hay. They evolved with grasslands, and they have a very unique digestive system that allows them to take a fairly low quality forage and extract energy from it. And that's something that's really unique about horses, and sometimes I think we forget that. Go ahead, go to the next one. Modern pastures really can be a high quality feed source if they're well managed and in a relatively inexpensive feed source. What are you all paying for a square bale of hay now? $8 or $9, probably for grass hay. Alfalfa is probably 10 to 12, a small square. Bermuda's 9. So it's a fairly expensive hobby to have a horse, right? So it's important to remember that the longer we can graze into the fall, the better off we're going to be in terms of feeding our horses, in terms of an inexpensive feed source. And the last thing to remember about having a good sod in a pasture is that it provides a safe surface for your horses to exercise on. I remember exactly where I was when I took this picture. It wasn't in Kentucky, it was actually in Virginia, but this is a horse pasture that had been grazed pretty hard in the winter months. And unfortunately, we probably have a few of these horse pastures in Kentucky that looks like this. And essentially, there was no vegetation on this pasture. And when we have no vegetation, especially on an evening like this, we're going to have soil loss. And as that soil moves away, it's also carrying nutrients off site. And if there's any manure in the pasture, it's going to wash it into the waterway. It's going to get into the streams and eventually into the lake. This is what we want to avoid. Not because it's ugly, but because it's an environmental hazard. So what do we do about that? We maintain a ground cover. The healthier ground cover that we can maintain, we're going to do several things. We're going to reduce weeds in our pastures, right? Because if we have a good ground cover in our pasture, weeds won't have a space to germinate in. And the second thing is we're going to conserve soil. We're going to reduce erosion and increase water infiltration into that pasture. All right, so now I want to take just a few minutes and talk about forage plant growth and grazing management. I think this is essential for you all to understand how forage plants grow and how they respond to grazing in your pasture. And once you have that understanding, then you'll start to understand how to manage that plant under grazing. So I always like to start out with this diagram, and there's chemical formulas for this, but I like this diagram the best, and it really talks about photosynthesis. And if we think about photosynthetic model for plants, the factory is the leaf blade of the plant. That's what has the machinery to carry out photosynthesis. And like any factory model, we have raw inputs that kind of come in to this factory, And our raw inputs for photosynthesis is sunlight, water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide. And they go in and we produce, in our photosynthetic factory, the leaf blade of the plant, we produce sugars and carbohydrates. That's our product. And those sugars and carbohydrates can go two places. They can go to what I call the consumer outlet, and that's for growth and maintenance of the plant. They supply the energy needs of that plant. Or they can be stored up for later use. Now, what determines where they go is the demand. So if there's demand for growth and energy for growth and maintenance of the plant, that's going to get first billing, always. Only when we're meeting that demand do the extras get shifted into storage. This storage is really important in a plant. If we allow our plants to store up sugars and carbohydrates, when they go through a stressful period like a drought or excessive water or a grazing event or winter, then they'll be able to come back strong because they have an energy source to promote regrowth after that stressful event leaves. Okay, so we have a defoliation event taking place here. Do you recognize that nose, Angie? And horses are really good at grazing close, right? And so we have a defoliation event here. So my question is, if we have adequate water and we have adequate nutrients in that pasture, what do we need for regrowth? So if we got good soil nutrients and good water, what do we need for regrowth? Anybody know? Don't be shy. Leaves, good. What are the leaves doing? They're capturing what? Sunlight, right? Go ahead and hit the next one. And that sunlight is going through photosynthesis and we're producing energy. So we need energy to fuel that regrowth. And that energy comes from two places. It comes from leaf area remaining after grazing, so that's that photosynthetic factory. If we graze our pastures really close, what happens to that photosynthetic factory? It gets really small, right? So if our pastures look like this tabletop all summer long, how do you think they're doing? Not well, right? So, and it comes from those stored carbohydrates that we talked about earlier, that warehouse in the plant. So when a grass plant regrows in a pasture, it's getting energy from two places: leaf area remaining after grazing and stored carbohydrates in that plant. Now, different plants store carbohydrates in different places. And a good example would be orchard grass. So orchard grass stores its carbohydrates in the stem base. Do you think it matters where it stores its carbohydrates at? Some, right? It's going to impact how we manage that plant under grazing, right? So if I know orchard grass or other tall growing primary pasture grass to be tall fescue stores its carbohydrates in the stem base. So this is a tall fescue tiller. If it's storing its carbohydrates primarily from where my top thumb is to my bottom thumb, and I let my horses graze it all the way down to the ground, what's happening? So we're removing all the leaf area, right? So we remove the leaf area, we've got nothing to capture sunlight with, and then we're saying, oh, well, go ahead and graze it a little bit more, right? And I remove this stem base. And remember, the carbohydrates are stored in that stem base. This plant's not going to do well under that type of management, and unfortunately, a lot of times in horse pastures, that's the kind of management we have. So we need to think about how we can manage this plant to leave some stem base and to leave some leaf area so that regrowth is quick after grazing. One of the worst things that's happened to orchard grass is the invention of the disc mower. And if you mow orchard grass with a disc mower, chances are you're mowing it too low. Orchard grass should really have somewhere between 3 and 4 inches of residual after you mow it in a hayfield. And a lot of times we can mow down to an inch or lower with a disc mower. And especially as we're moving into summer, that really damages orchard grass stands. Now, something like Bermuda grass, is that a forage or a weed? I guess it depends where it's at, right? So if it's in your wife's flowers, it's definitely a weed, right? But if it's in my horse pasture, it may not be too bad. Junior and I planted a Bermuda grass trial last year. So And we got a pretty good stand for the establishment year. So if it makes it through this cold temperatures that we had in January, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. And we're going to have a field day out there, hopefully this summer, if everything looks good, and you can take a look at some seeded Bermuda grass cultivars. But Bermuda grass stores its rhizomes, energy in stolons and rhizomes, and those are those structures that kind of grow along the soil surface or right below the soil surface. It allows Bermuda grass to kind of creep out. And because it stores its carbohydrates there, it can be grazed really close because its carbohydrates are safely below the grazing height of the animal in that pasture. I wanted to talk, just mention the carbohydrate cycle, and CHO is just an abbreviation for carbohydrate cycle. And I like to use alfalfa as an example. Alfalfa is 100% dependent on stored carbohydrates for regrowth. So what that means is I can cut an alfalfa plant all the way off, remove all the leaf area, and it still grows back really fast because it is getting all of its energy for regrowth from carbohydrates that have been stored up in the plant. In alfalfa, those stored carbohydrates are in the taproot of the plant. So as this plant starts to regrow here, this line is showing regrowth, this is what's happening to the non-structural carbohydrates or the energy stored in the roots. We get a very fast decrease in those stored carbohydrates. They're being mobilized to fuel regrowth of this plant. And then all of a sudden, when that plant gets about 8 inches tall or so, these start to go back up. What's happening at that point? What do we rebuild on that plant? It's leaf structure, right? That photosynthetic factory. So when we rebuild that leaf structure, it's all of a sudden it's fixing enough carbon or carrying out enough photosynthesis that it's meeting the energy needs for growth and maintenance of the plant, and the extra is getting shifted back into storage. So these stored carbohydrate levels go back up, and by the time we're ready to cut alfalfa again in 30 days, we're back up to pre-cut levels. The same thing happens in all pasture plants. It's most pronounced in alfalfa because it's 100% dependent on stored carbohydrates for regrowth. But all pasture plants have this. So say this was a pasture plant in my horse pasture and I grazed it off and it started to regrow. It got up to about 6 or 8 inches. And then I came in and my horse grazed it off again. What happens? Well, it's going to regrow, but these carbohydrates are going to go lower. And every time we do that, they're going to go lower and the regrowth is going to be slower. And the more we do that, and that's exactly what happens in a continuously grazed pasture. Every time those plants try to regrow a little bit, the horse is right there to nip off that nice vegetative regrowth. And over time, the regrowth is slower and slower and slower, and then eventually that plant will die. And so when that plant dies, what's it leave in your pasture? A hole, right? What grows in a hole? A weed, that's right. So our best defense against weeds in a pasture is really having a good solid stand of forage that prevents them from germinating and growing. All right, this is one of my favorite diagrams. This is from a really old publication by a guy named Roy Blazer at Virginia Tech. And this is a tall fescue tiller. So this is like one little piece of a tall fescue plant. And tall fescues are primary pasture grass, love it or hate it, in western Kentucky. And what I want to show you is that when the collar's present here, the collar is this little structure where the leaf kind of goes on the stem. When that's present, this leaf is no longer expanding in tall fescue in other cool season grasses. So the question is, if there's no more expansion in this leaf, what do we do with it? Do we graze it off or do we leave it? So don't answer that yet. I want to pass out a few tall fescue tillers. So right there's that's the collar of that. So this leaf is not expanding anymore. I just pulled these up today from the outside in the pasture. So right there's the collar structure. So this leaf's no longer expanding. That's a nice one. So this is the collar. Right there. So this. Oh, I lost it. So guys, this is the collar right here.
Mm-hmm.
This leaf is no longer expanding, okay?
Okay.
So this is the collar region right here. This leaf, once it's grazed off like there, is no longer going to expand. That's a collar. There, this leaf is no longer going to expand. I know you guys have seen this before, but I'll give you one anyways. So that's the collar right there. So once that's exposed, that leaf's not going to grow anymore. So the question is what do you do with that? If you know that leaf's not going to grow, what do you do with it? Here's a nice one. So the collar's right here. So this leaf is not going to grow anymore. Do we leave it or graze it off? Think about that. So right there is a tall fescue, and this is the collar right here. So this leaf is not going to regrow anymore. Right there's the collar and that leaf. I'm running out of grass plants here. So that's the collar region right here. So this leaf right here is not going to regrow anymore. Did you get one already?
I got one.
Did you guys get one? So this is the collar region right here. So this leaf is not going to grow anymore. So this is the collar region right here. This leaf is not going to regrow anymore. This right here is the collar region, kind of right where this leaf comes through the stem. So this one's not going to regrow anymore. Okay, I had just enough tillers. So the question is what do you do with that leaf that the collar's exposed on? Do you leave it or do you graze it off? Before you answer that, tell me, I saved this one for me. Tell me what color is this leaf? Okay, what's green mean? What? Photosynthesis, that's right. So go ahead and go down, Angie. So we go down one more. So the point is that even though this leaf's not expanding anymore, it's still carrying out photosynthesis. Where do you think the energy is going? That's right, back down into the plant, and it's helping fuel the growth of this new leaf that you see coming out right here on this tiller. So it's important that when we think about grazing management, that we think about leaving some residual leaf area in pastures, because that residual leaf area, even though it may not be expanding, it's fueling growth of that new tiller, that new leaf that's coming out. So let's talk a little bit about getting in control of grazing management. Go ahead to the next one. So when we talk about controlled grazing or rotational grazing or management intensive grazing or whatever you want to call it, what we're talking about is managing residual leaf area. So that means how close we graze that pasture. Go to the next one, Angie. And we're talking about managing carbohydrate reserves. So that's that energy that's stored up in that pasture plant. Those are the two things that we're managing when we talk about grazing management. Go ahead and go to the next one. So one thing I want to mention about rotational grazing is we talk a lot about drought. We had a pretty bad drought last year, but how we manage that pasture prior to drought is going to have an impact on how drought tolerant that pasture is for two reasons. The first reason is that what we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the soil surface. So if I'm grazing my pastures down to a tabletop, what do you think the root system looks like underneath the soil? It's going to be pretty small. So if I'm managing my pastures rotationally, I'm leaving maybe 4 inches of growth on there and rotating to another pasture. That root system is going to be much more extensive. And that's going to help that pasture grow into a drought and come out of that drought strong. The other thing that I want to mention is that, let's see here. Okay, let's go up and we'll start at the top here, Ange. So That's all right. One horse. How many of you are stocked at 2 acres per horse? Junior, I got one. Everybody more or less? More horses per acre? Less? Good. Good. So stocking rate is really important in pasture management, right? If we're overstocked, it's going to be hard to maintain a healthy pasture. We can do it, but it's going to take some discipline, right? So I say it's a requirement and not an option, but there are some things that we can do in terms of pasture management that will allow you to keep a healthy pasture if you're disciplined and do them. When we start talking about a rotational grazing system, a good number of paddocks have to have 4 to 6 paddocks that you can rotate in between. So I graze through one paddock, I graze down to my target height, which should be somewhere in that 3 to 5 inch range, and then once the forage gets that low, I move to the next paddock. So I'm not rotating based on days. A lot of people want to rotate based on days, but days change as the time of the year changes, as weather conditions change. So a pasture in the summer is going to regrow a lot slower than a pasture in the spring when growth is really rapid. Paddock size. Well, it's going to depend on the number of horses you have and how often you want to rotate those pastures. So you just have to sit down and think about that. But generally speaking, the more horses in a pasture, the larger it's going to be to get the same number of days in the rotation. And then we need to think about having a sacrifice area. And a sacrifice area is someplace where you can go when things aren't going well. So if I get into a drought, instead of damaging all my pastures, I go to a sacrifice paddock, put the animals in there, and I start to feed some hay. And that's a really important management tool, especially if you're pushing your stocking rate towards the high end. You want to be well drained, low erosion potential, surrounded by a grass buffer. Sometimes you even can make a hardened surface within that sacrifice area so that you have some place to go when things get muddy like they will in the next several days. All right, so let's talk about the real world. So that's kind of the ideal situation. The real world is, go ahead, Ange. Not everybody's got 2 to 3 acres per horse. That's the real world, right? Go on to the next one. We can't control the weather. Sometimes it's going to drought, sometimes we're going to have a flood, but what we can control is grazing. And that's what we need to manage in a pasture. Go ahead and go to the next one. So what do? We subdivide our big pasture. If we only have one pasture, we start to rotate our animals through it. Ideally 4 to 6 paddocks, rotate based on grass height, not time period, but grass height. We don't want to graze a cool season grass or grass closer than about 3 to 4 inches. Don't graze pastures that haven't regrown. So if you're rotating through there and you get into a dry period and you get back to your first pasture and it hasn't regrown, put your animals in a sacrifice area, feed some hay, and allow those pastures to adapt to drought stress and regrow after the rain comes. And that takes discipline. If you're a little bit overstocked, you're going to have to use that sacrifice area more than other people would that are stocked at 2 to 3 acres per horse. Go back one more, Ange. I just want to see if yep, okay, go ahead. All right, this is an example of a little grazing system that we helped set up with our friend in Virginia. It's a 6 paddock system. The nice thing about this system is that we were able to make a nice sacrifice area here. We've got 6 paddocks. All paddocks have access back to shade and water, which is important for horses. And then we have 2 paddocks that are warm season grasses in this system. So we have 4 paddocks that are cool season grass, tall fescue primarily, maybe a little bit of clover in it. And then we have a Bermuda grass paddock, and we had close your ears, Dr. Witt, a crabgrass paddock. Okay? And those 2 paddocks provided a tremendous amount of grazing during the summer months when our cool season grass growth was limited by temperature. We often think cool season grass growth like orchard grass and tall fescue is limited by moisture in the summertime, but it's limited as much by high temperatures. Once we get above 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the leaf blade temperature, photosynthesis starts to decline, especially as we get over 80 degrees. So even though that pasture grass is there, it's not actively growing during the summer months. So this is a very nice, simple system. It was set up on about, each paddock is about an acre within this system, and then she had probably, I don't remember, yeah, she had 6 or 8 horses on this, so she was overstocked. But she was able to manage those pastures because she had a rotational grazing system in place. All right, so let's talk about options for right now. And Shane asked me to mention some cool season annuals or annual options that we have for pastures that have really been damaged by the drought last summer and then the wet conditions this summer. And I'll just say that we don't have a lot of great cool season options. So normally we would talk about things like wheat and barley and cereal rye, but they just don't do that well when we plant them in the spring. They really need to go through a vernalization, which is a cold period, to get optimum growth in the spring. So our best option is spring oats. And spring oats can be a good option. It's not perfect, but it can provide grazing in the spring, and then we can also make hay out of spring oats if we're in a hay production system. So soil test and adjust soil fertility when we think about things we need to do to plant spring oats. We want to plant 90 to 120 pounds of spring oats per acre. How much is that going to cost right now? Anybody know what a bag of spring oats is costing right now? $25, that's right. That's $50 an acre to plant spring oats. And the bad thing about spring oats, like the other small grains, is once we remove that growing point, we're not going to get much residual growth in that crop. It's going to provide some emergency forage, but it's by far not perfect. One thing we can do is add a little bit of annual ryegrass to that spring oats, and that annual ryegrass will give us a little bit more grazing as we move into summer. Unlike small grains, annual ryegrass will regrow after grazing until growth becomes limited by temperature. So we can add 10 pounds of annual ryegrass, and that's going to be a pretty cheap fix with the spring oats. All annuals like nitrogen, so we're going to need a little bit of nitrogen to really get growth going if we're going to try this. And if you want to plant spring oats and annual ryegrass, I mean, it needs to be happening now. So you really need to get into these pastures and get it seeded in the next week or two. We can begin grazing at 8 to 10 inches, stop grazing at 3 to 4 inches. And once those plants joint and that growing point moves up in a spring oat, once it's grazed off, then it's not going to really regrow much. If you have annual ryegrass, that annual ryegrass will provide a little bit more growth. So let's talk a little bit about annual ryegrass, and I'll just say that it's best if we plant annual ryegrass in the fall. So that's the ideal situation. So as you're moving forward, if you know you're going to have some paddocks that are going to be pretty denuded come this fall, then we really need to think about planting annual ryegrass in late summer or early fall. And that's going to give you good forage production, especially as you move into March and April the following year. And this is just some data on annual ryegrass, but what I want to show is that on average, we're producing somewhere between 3.5 to 4 tons of dry matter with well-managed annual ryegrass. It won't produce that much under grazing, it's going to produce less, but it can be extremely productive if it's fall planted and fertilized. This is probably my favorite cool season annual. I know Dr. Witt doesn't like it because it's a bad weed in row crops. But in pastures, it's not a weed, it's really a forage crop. High yielding, excellent forage quality. Can be grazed, hayed, or ensiled. Of course, in the pasture, we would graze it. Regrows after each cutting. So unlike a small grain that once we remove that growing point, it doesn't regrow. Annual ryegrass will regrow after each cutting until it becomes temperature limited in late spring or early summer. Adapted to a wide range of soils, has fairly consistent production. It does require nitrogen fertilization. We can grow it in combination with a warm season grass. So not exactly at the same time, but we can overseed a warm season pasture like a Bermuda grass pasture or some of you may have naturally occurring Bermuda grass in your pastures that goes dormant. This is a good option for overseeding that pasture with. And I know Mary Ann does that, and she can tell you her own personal experience with that. Or we can double crop it with a summer annual, and we'll talk about a summer annual in a minute that we can use. Is it good for horses? That's the big question. So what's one of the challenges with horses in cool season annuals in general? Anybody know? There's lots of sugars and carbohydrates in cool season annuals like annual ryegrass and oats and other small grains. And for most horses, that's probably okay, but there are horses that have some metabolic challenges where it may not be a good choice for them. And I don't know about that, but Dr. Coleman would know about that. And if you have a question on that, you can ask him. All right, so again, it's best planted in the fall. If you are going to plant it in the spring, if you can get an Italian ryegrass versus a Westerwald, the Italian has a better chance of growing into summer than a Westerwald type. Plant 25 pounds per acre alone or 10 pounds in a mix with a small grain. P&K according to soil test. 60 pounds of nitrogen at seeding. You really want to stimulate that growth of the annual ryegrass. And start to graze it when it reaches a height of 6 to 8 inches. Stop grazing at 3 to 4 inches. So, and then allow it to regrow to 6 to 8 inches and start the cycle again. And that will occur pretty quick in the early spring. This is the one that's going to make Dr. Witt, I see him grimacing right now. Crabgrass, and we always think of crabgrass as a weed, and it certainly is if it's in the wrong place. But there's probably a half a dozen named cultivars of crabgrass out there. And it's well adapted to this whole region of the country. It truly is a warm season annual grass. It kind of acts like a perennial through self-reseeding. And we often see that in lawns. It just, even under a very close defoliation height, will produce viable seed that goes to the soil. So if we manage for self-reseeding, it can actually reseed itself and we won't have to buy another crop next year. It really needs to be in a double cropping system with the winter annual. Good yield potential, excellent forage quality. If you're in a situation where you're chronically overstocked in your pastures, this may be a good choice. Planting ryegrass in the fall and overseeding with a little bit of crabgrass in the spring. Because it's going to be very hard to maintain a perennial grass like orchard grass or tall fescue when you're overstocked and continuously grazing. Go ahead, go to the next one, Ange. This is just a photo of some crabgrass from a study that we did when I was in Virginia. This is 60 days after planting. It's an improved variety named Red River Crabgrass. I just threw this slide in. This was a nitrogen response study, but you can see how closely it tracks nitrogen in terms of yield. So yield's on our y-axis, nitrogen rate is on our x-axis. Don't ever put 305 pounds of nitrogen on crabgrass. You want to be down here on the straight part of the curve. So start out with 60 pounds, and maybe if you want to stimulate a little more growth after you graze it once or twice, put on another 30 or 40 pounds. But it does respond well to nitrogen management. Forage quality, go ahead. It has very high digestibility. And crude protein ranged between 6 and 14% in this particular study. In season, when it was actively growing, it was 10 to 14% in most cases. And of course, it's related to nitrogen fertilization also. With our warm season grasses, crude protein is commonly tied to nitrogen fertilization. So just a little bit on management. We want to establish with light tillage ideally. It's a very small seed, so not deeper than 1/4 of an inch into the seed bed. You can broadcast it as early as now and then incorporate it with pasture drag. We want to seed 3 to 4 pounds of uncoated seed per acre, and that's going to be hard to do. So a lot of times you'll have to take 3 to 4 pounds of uncoated seed, mix it with some kind of a carrier. It could be a fertilizer, it could be a pelleted limestone, cracked corn, it doesn't really matter, but something kind of dilute that seed. And then remember, it's throwing the carrier further than the seed, so if they'll throw the crabgrass seed about half as far as the carrier. Let's see, if you're using coated seed, then you want to use about 6 to 8 pounds, because about 50% of the weight of the seed will be in that seed coating material. And the coated seed is easier to handle, but it is a little bit more expensive per acre. And then again, start grazing crabgrass at 6 to 8 inches in height, and stop grazing at 3 to 4 inches. Crabgrass is going to be productive from about June until sometime in late September. And then it really starts to decline. And it kind of senses the end of the season and seems to really throw its energy into seed production. Okay. And then I'm just going to finish up by saying that with proper pasture management, horse owners can maintain a healthy and vigorous sod that's going to benefit the horse, the environment, and the owner all at the same time. So is there any questions, one or two, before we move on to the next speaker? So it depends on if you get a coated crabgrass, it'll run fine through a regular seeder. If you have an uncoated crabgrass, it can bridge in the seeder. So a lot of times we'll mix it with some type of carrier to get the flow through the seeder. The coated seed handles much better than the uncoated seed, but you are paying a little bit of a premium for that coating. Is there any other questions? All right, thank you for your attention.